Alan is a 30-year-old hardcore gamer who hasn't seen sunlight in weeks at this point, but who could blame him? He just finished playing a no-hit run on both Sekiro and Dark Souls at the same time. However, now that he's done with that, he needs a new game to play so he doesn't get bored. GTA 6 still isn't out yet, so he starts searching online for another game to play in the meantime, and that's when he comes across a game that never ends. Normally, you'd be concerned about the fact that a game just loaded onto his computer without permission, but he's too captivated to go back now. So he starts scrolling through the settings wheel to set the difficulty. He wants his gaming experience to be as traumatizing as possible, so he turns the difficulty all the way up to hell mode and picks the untested summoner class just to make it even more unpredictable. He then accepts all the terms and conditions without a second thought, but it turns out that there was a clause in there about transporting Alan to another world, so the next thing he knows, he's a newborn baby in the countryside. A year goes by like this, and being a baby isn't as bad as Alan thought it would be. He doesn't have to work or pay any bills, and he has good, loving parents taking care of him. His father's name is Roden, and his mother is Theresia, and they seem like a lovely couple, but considering the fact that Alan set the game to hell mode, they're likely going to get the Wayne family treatment sooner or later. After Alan is put to bed for the night, he raises his arms and tries all the key phrases he knows in an attempt to open a status screen, because even though he's supposed to be a summoner, he has no idea how the whole summoning thing works. He decides to give it one last try before going to sleep, and this time, something really does appear. But it startles Alan so much that he screams, and his parents come running over to check on him as soon as they hear it, so he is forced to hide the book for now. After making sure Alan is okay, his parents leave his room, and as soon as they are gone, he pulls out his book again. He is so relieved that he finally gets to see his stats after a whole year of trying, and it's around what you would expect for a 1-year-old summoner. His summoning skills are all bottom tier, but the book says they will level up the more he uses them, so Alan decides to give it a try right now. From what he can tell, he's only allowed to summon H-ranked insects and beasts at his current level, but that seems ridiculously weak, so he isn't expecting much. Just then, the book flips to the message section, and Alan finds out that he received a letter from the god of creation of this world. The god basically apologizes for the delay in creating Alan's status book, but since the summoner class was still under development, it took him a whole year to sort through all the necessary paperwork for it. Alan doesn't really care about the apology, but if the god dev team had to rush to finish the summoner class, then there must be some bugs left in there for him to exploit, so he's eager to test it out. He wants to summon an insect first, but he soon realizes that he doesn't actually know how to activate his summoning ability. Normally, he would check the subreddit or watch a tutorial for these kinds of problems, but he doesn't have any internet here, so he's going to have to figure it out on his own. He thinks about it for a few minutes and eventually realizes that he needs to create an insect skill card first, so he gives it a try, and it works perfectly. Now he can finally summon his insect, but before he could do so, his mother comes to check on him again, so Alan is forced to pretend that he's asleep again. The next morning, once his parents are busy with their daily duties, Alan opens his grimoire and finally summons the Grasshopper. The room fills with tons of bright lights, and at first, Alan is mesmerized by how pretty it looks, but then a giant grasshopper flies into his face and he freaks out. He eventually realizes that this is the grasshopper he summoned, so he tries to give it instructions. But it turns out that even though it's a summon, it still only has grasshopper intelligence, so it can't understand a word he's saying. On the bright side, Alan finds out that summoning the grasshopper gave him a boost to his agility and endurance stats, and he's really happy about that, but all of his celebrating gets his mother's attention, and once she finds the giant grasshopper on the floor, she immediately squishes it. Over the next few days, Alan tinkers with the insect summoning ability, but he's tired of that now, so he decides to try out the beast summon next. He summons a mouse, and once again the book sends it flying straight at his face, but Alan was expecting it this time, so he's not as startled. The mouse comes with its own set of buffs, but it's still pretty dumb, so Alan can't really talk to it. That said, one of its abilities is called Scurry, and whenever Alan tells the mouse to use it, it does so without fail. That said, this mouse's ability is downright useless, so Alan figures he will need to level up his abilities in order to summon some of the more powerful creatures out there. His grimoire says he's allowed to stock up to 10 summoning cards at once, and fortunately, the buffs for each summon stack as well. So if he stacks 10 mouse summon cards, his attack and HP go up by 10. This already makes him stronger than any regular baby, but he's going to have to level up his skills if he wants to become truly overpowered. Normally, this wouldn't be hard to do, but remember how Alan selected Hell mode because he thought the difficulty would be fun? Well, leveling up now requires 100 times the normal amount of experience, so he's going to be stuck grinding for a long time. Just then, Roden returns from a long day of hunting, and he's completely covered in blood, but it's okay because it's not his blood. He explains that he just hunted a great boar with the other men from the village, and Alan seems really interested, so Roden asks him if he would like to come see it. Alan excitedly agrees, so Roden hoists him onto his neck and starts taking him towards the kill site. This is Alan's first time actually getting to see the outside world, so he's enjoying all the new sights, but it took a lot longer to get to the boar than he thought it would, so he ended up falling asleep in Roden's arms. Once they arrive at the kill site, Roden wakes Alan up to show him the boar, and Alan is stunned because this thing is absolutely massive, and I'm not even sure how Roden managed to take it down in the first place. A few moments later, the villagers nearby notice that Roden has come back, so they all start cheering for him because he is today's MVP. Alan asks if a great boar is really that strong, so Gerda explains that it is a C-ranked monster, and it usually takes at least 20 men to take one down, so they are pretty tough. This info is really useful to Alan because it gives him a solid benchmark on the strength gap between ranks, but before he can even think about summoning any high-ranked monster, Alan is going to have to start grinding XP to level up. 10 months of intense grinding later, Alan has finally risen to a level 2 summoner, and the bump comes with great perks like an all-around boost to his stats, as well as the ability to summon G-rank creatures and fuse them. But doing so requires a lot of MP, so Alan hurriedly eats his dinner to recover some mana and heads back to his room to try it out. Unfortunately, when he opens his grimoire, it tells him he still doesn't have enough mana to fuse any summons because his max MP is too low, so it looks like he's going to need to do even more grinding before he can try anything new. By the time Alan is 3 years old, he has finally raised his MP stats high enough to use his level 2 skill, and with the fusion section, he is able to create a G-rank bird which he names Chappie. Chappie's main skill is Voice Mimic, and it can basically copy any voice perfectly, making it perfect for distracting enemies. Alan was also able to summon a frog and a mole, and the frog's only ability is to jump up and down while flashing as a distraction, but the mole is a lot more active and can dig a giant hole in a matter of seconds. The G-rank monster skills are a lot more useful than the H-ranks, so Alan is finally starting to enjoy the gaming experience in this world, but it's still going to take a long time before he's strong enough to actually fight anything. And speaking of fighting, Gerda's daughter, Krena, comes looking for Alan because she wants to play with him. Krena's idea of playing is challenging him to a duel, and normally, this wouldn't be a problem, but she's way too strong for Alan to keep up with. He even went all out with his summoned buffs just to give himself a fighting chance, but he's still no match for her. By the end of the day, Alan and Krena return home, and apparently, while Alan has been grinding his XP this past year, Roden and Theresia were getting busy because she's pregnant again. Since his mother can't do much physical labor anymore, Alan volunteers to help with the harvest to make things easier for Roden. He is sure he can do it because with all his buffs, he pretty much has the strength and stamina of an adult now. But Theresia and Roden don't think it would be fair to make their son work, so they tell him he should just stick to doing basic house chores and playing with Krena. Roden reminds him that he will eventually grow up and have to get a job, so he should enjoy his time as a kid while he doesn't need to work. Alan is a little upset about being turned down at first, but then he remembers that farm work is unbelievably grueling work, and no father would want to force their 3-year-old to do that kind of work, so he agrees to let it go. Roden is glad to see that Alan understands, but as they continue with dinner, Theresia recalls seeing Alan in the backyard throwing rocks at a tree a little while ago, so she asks him what that was all about. Alan says he was just practicing for self-defense in case a monster attacks their home, but in reality, he was trying to see if he can learn skills aside from summoning by repeating an action over and over, but he didn't have much luck with that. Roden is impressed by Alan's work ethic and says he can't wait for his appraisal ceremony. Alan has never heard of the appraisal ceremony before, so he asks Roden what it is, and he is informed that when you turn 5, you are appraised to find out what talents you may have. And if Alan is lucky enough to receive a powerful talent, he might become very rich and successful in the future. Winter rolls around, and Alan decides to summon a grasshopper out in the snow to see how long it can survive, and it lasts a whole day out here, so he's pretty satisfied. However, that satisfaction quickly fades away when Krena comes outside and starts asking him to fight her again. Unsurprisingly, Alan ends up getting his ass handed to him. But while he was busy with his duel against Krena, he completely forgot about the grasshopper he summoned, and it ends up crawling onto Theresia's leg, scaring her so much that she ends up falling over. And falling over while pregnant is a big deal. Roden runs over to check on her, and she says she's fine, but she clearly isn't because that fall just sent her into labor, so the baby's coming today whether they like it or not. Roden tells Krena to go call her mother for help, and once she arrives, she helps Theresia through the delivery process. So by morning, the family has a brand new baby boy. Everyone is overjoyed, but Alan doesn't know how he should feel about this. He still isn't sure why a game reincarnated him into this world. But even though it was unexpected, he didn't have much going for him back in Japan, so he's not upset with how things turned out. That's why he has decided to focus solely on leveling up and protecting his new family, because they matter the most to him. By springtime, since Alan's appraisal ceremony is coming up, he asks his dad for some details on what it's like. His dad tells him that all kids have to do it once they turn 5, and if he happens to have an amazing skill, he has a decent chance of making it to the big leagues. But unfortunately, there's a lot of competition this year since a lot of the other kids are also turning 5, and that includes Krena. They all head to the commoner's city so they can undergo the appraisal, but as they approach the church, Alan notices that a lot of the other commoners look really well groomed. Compared to them, he's pretty much wearing rags, and now that he thinks about it, he's been wearing rags since the day he was born, so his family's finances must be way below average for this world, but that doesn't really bother him. They all gather in front of the church, and as the priests come out, they hear a lot of people making fun of the brokies in the crowd, so they tell everyone that they had better be careful of what they say. Blessings are distributed equally to all, so even the poorest farmer could inherit a powerful skill. The priests tell everyone to come inside for the appraisal, and as they are walking towards an altar, Alan notices 3 statues and assumes those must be the gods that are worshipped in this world. One of which is Elmea, the god of creation, and now that Alan thinks about it, Elmea was the one who sent him that apology letter for the class development delay. The first up for appraisal is Palomas, the son of the village chieftain, and he is instructed to place his hand on the crystal ball over there to display his stats. Palomas does as instructed, and on the stone wall, it is revealed that he possesses the merchant class, news that his father is really happy to hear. Alan was kind of expecting more to happen, but this is basically the same thing his grimoire does, with the only difference being the fact that it uses letter rankings instead of numbers. As the appraisal continues, some kids receive strong talents, while some don't receive any at all, and a few hours later, the only ones left are Krena and Alan. Krena is up next, so she excitedly runs up to the ball and puts her hand over it, but it suddenly starts glowing with an intense blinding light. Her father is worried that something might have gone wrong with the appraisal, but it turns out that the priests simply can't believe what they are seeing. According to the appraisal, Krena just received the Sword Lord class, one of the strongest in existence, and her dad is unbelievably happy about it, but she doesn't really understand what's so special about it. Alan isn't too surprised by the news since he's been getting his ass beat by her for years at this point, but next up is Alan's appraisal, so he is told to approach the altar. As he touches the ball, nothing happens for a few seconds, but all of a sudden, there's a large flash of light, and Alan is knocked back. Roden rushes over to check on him, and after making sure Alan is alright, he walks over to the priest and asks what Alan's talent is since he doesn't know how to read. He's expecting something really good since the crystal reacted strongly, but to his shock, the priest informs him that Alan is completely talentless. Alan can't believe what he's hearing because he knows for a fact that he does have a talent, but when he checks the board, he realizes that all his stats are E rank across the board, and he blames Elmea for doing a shitty job coding the summoner class. Just then, Roden hugs Alan from behind to comfort him since he doesn't want Alan to feel bad about being talentless. They head home together, and everyone treats him normally despite the revelation that he is classless, and Alan appreciates how much his family cares for him, but he knows he isn't really talentless. He can still use his grimoire just fine, so he assumes his E-rank stats must be because he is playing on Hell mode. All the other kids were the same age as him, and relatively equal in strength, so their rank must be a reflection of how much they will grow in the future as they level up. So since Alan requires 100 times the regular amount of XP to level up, his stats are all stuck at E rank, even if his actual attributes are pretty strong. Most people would get frustrated by this kind of setback, but Alan isn't some filthy casual who enjoys playing games for actual fun. He lives for the soul-crushing grind, but he can't help but worry that there's something wrong with his summoner class because at the bottom of his appraisal, he saw a confusing error code pop up, so he's going to be sending a lot of complaints to the devs about it. The next morning, Alan goes out with his family to visit Krena's family, but he notices that his dad has been acting a bit strange lately. Over at Krena's house, they are all about to celebrate Krena's appraisal as a sword lord, but Roden still has a sour look on his face, and Jurda says he refuses to celebrate with him until he goes back to normal. At first, Alan wonders if Roden is jealous of Krena and her family, but he knows his dad isn't that petty, so there must be something else going on here. The two of them continue arguing for a second until Gerda reveals that Roden mentioned severing ties between their families before they sat down together. Roden defends his decision by reminding Gerda that Krena is a sword lord now, and that means she practically has a guaranteed ticket out of this tiny serfdom, and if she's lucky, she might even become nobility if she's lucky. And if that happens, then being close to a poor family like Roden's would only hold her back. Gerda yells that he doesn't care about any of that stuff, but Roden keeps insisting that he's doing this for Gerda's own good, and the two resume their fight, but eventually, their wives pull them apart and get them to calm down. Alan is a bit surprised by how calm everyone was about this whole thing, so he asks Gerda's wife if it's normal for them to argue like this. She explains that this kind of thing used to happen all the time, but they always made up afterwards. All four of them are actually childhood friends who grew up in the same village, and around 10 years ago, when talks of making a new settlement started, they all decided to join the effort and work together to build their houses. Gerda and Roden bonded a lot over that back then. Recalling the good times makes them realize how silly their fight was. A little while later, news arrives that the Knight's Order has shown an interest in Krena, and they are coming to see her. Alan assumes the news of Krena becoming a sword lord must be spreading really quickly. But while it's good that she has earned some recognition from the Knight's Order, Gerda is still a little concerned because she is too young to become a knight yet. Just then, one of the kids who got a good talent at the appraisal ceremony confronts Alan and tells him that as a talentless loser, he has no place here. Alan doesn't really care about being insulted, since he's still got his summoner power, but Krena won't stand for anyone picking on her best friend, so she tells the kid to back off and nearly chops off his finger before Gerda pulls her back. Just then, the chief announces that the Knight's Order has finally arrived, and everyone is thrilled since they rarely get to see the knights in person. The chief calls for Gerda and Krena to come introduce themselves to the knight captain. Krena is unbelievably excited because she has always wanted to become a knight, so getting to meet the knight captain must be a dream come true for her. Alan wonders if the knights are going to take Krena to the capital to train her. But before the knight captain could say anything, Gerda speaks up and says he can't let Krena go because she's still too young. The captain says that age doesn't matter because if she's a sword lord, then her skills would be more than enough to get her through the training, so there should be no problem. Unless, of course, they were lying about Krena being a sword saint just to trick the Knight's Order. Gerda assures the captain that he isn't lying, but it's already too late because the captain has decided to put Krena to the test. He orders his vice captain to prepare to have a duel with this 5-year-old, and without a second thought, the vice captain agrees. Gerda tries to get the knight captain to reconsider since he doesn't want to put Krena's life at risk, but he is told that if she doesn't fight, then it will serve as proof that she lied about her class, and she, along with her entire family, will be executed. The knights then bring out a sword for her to use, and most children would be terrified by this point, but Krena is so battle-hungry that the second she realizes that she gets to use an actual sword, she says she is willing to accept the duel. Everyone gets into position for the duel, and Leibrand faces off against Krena. So as the match begins, Krena charges at Leibrand with full force. Your eyes do not deceive you. She's swinging a sword that's twice her height like it's nothing, and she's actually giving Leibrand a run for his money, but he is still keeping her at bay relatively easily. The knight captain seems unimpressed by Krena's skills so far, but as the fight goes on, she manages to block one of Leibrand's strikes and prepares to retaliate. However, Leibrand punts her across the street and into one of the walls. Gerda is enraged by the way his daughter is being treated, but before he could do anything about it, he is pushed to the floor by the knights, along with Alan and Roden when they try to interfere. Alan thinks this is completely unfair, because whether Krena is a sword lord or not, an adult is bound to have more battle experience than her. However, all of a sudden, Krena gets back on her feet, and she's got a menacing aura surrounding her. Without saying a word, she launches another all-out attack with laser focus, and this time, she is completely overwhelming Leibrand, so much so that she eventually slices his sword in half and nearly takes his head off with it. Krena is disappointed that the fight is over already, but she had a lot of fun, so she thanks Leibrand for playing with her and walks off, leaving him with the knowledge that he just lost to a 5-year-old. Gerda is relieved that Krena managed to survive and starts praising her for doing a good job, but then the knight captain approaches, and Gerda becomes defensive because he doesn't want him anywhere near his daughter. The knight captain now acknowledges that Krena is indeed a sword lord, and he apologizes for forcing her to fight in a duel. He says he would like to discuss her future with him, but Gerda firmly refuses. The captain says he can bring his friends with him to the meeting if it would make him feel better, and that would make Gerda feel a little safer, so he agrees. They all gather at the chief's house for lunch, and Zenov once again apologizes for the way he acted earlier. He explains that he was sent here by the baron of this territory to determine whether there truly was a sword lord in this village, and the results are undeniable. Zenov mentions that 3 years ago, there was a sword saint born to the family of a count, but this strikes Alan as weird since he knows for a fact that sword saints can only be born from low social statuses according to the game's design, so that one must have been a fake. Said sword lord went on to serve the royal family, but failed to meet expectations there, and upon reappraisal, it was discovered that they were actually an ordinary swordsman pretending to be a sword lord. It was also later discovered that several nobles were greatly exaggerating their abilities, so the kingdom had to establish a zero-tolerance policy for falsified talent results. That said, he is still truly sorry for putting Krena through such a harsh trial. He tells Gerda that he doesn't need to worry about them taking Krena away from him because they won't do that. They want her to continue her training at home, and when she turns 12, if she wants, she can attend the academy to become a knight. 2 years of training later, Alan finally unlocks level 3 of his grimoire, and he is really excited about it. The level up grants him the enhanced skill, which means he can strengthen his summons now, and he can also hold 30 F-rank ones at once now, so the buffs he can stack are going to be amazing. He plans to experiment with it later, but for now, he's got to head back inside for dinner. As for updates on Alan's family, his little brother is turning 2, and his mom is pregnant again, so he's getting another little brother or sister. His parents start thinking of a name for the new kid, and at that moment, Alan happens to receive a message from the god of creation, Elmia, so he unconsciously says his name out loud. His parents misunderstand and assume Alan is suggesting they should name the baby after the god of creation, which is a big no-no in this world, and Alan can't really explain why he said it. So he quickly changes the subject and mentions how Gerda's scars seem to have completely vanished recently. Gerda explains that it's because he passed the trial of the gods earlier today while fighting a boar, but Alan has never heard of such a thing before, so he asks what it means, and Gerda explains that every once in a while, after a battle, you feel your body being refreshed and all your wounds being healed, and Alan assumes it must be the effects of leveling up in this world. Gerda is a strong warrior, so he must level up quite often, but as for Alan, even though his grimoire is level 3, his body is still only level 1 because he hasn't fought any monsters yet, and if he wants to grow stronger, then he's going to have to engage in battle. However, that's easier said than done, because he isn't allowed to leave the village without permission. The only exception to that rule would be hunting expeditions, but the second Alan tries to bring up the idea of joining the next hunt, his father turns him down because he doesn't want Alan putting himself in danger. That night, once everyone else is asleep, Alan opens his grimoire to read the message he got from Elmia, and he already has a good idea of what it's about since he left a strongly worded complaint after the appraisal ceremony. Long story short, Elmia apologizes for the technical bug that made Alan appear talentless during the appraisal, but it has been fixed now, so the next time he gets appraised, his summoner class will show up. It also explains that all of Alan's ranks show up as E rank because of his Hell mode difficulty, but in reality, he is a lot stronger than E rank, so a separate stat section has been added for him. Alan takes a look at his new stat sheet, and it's a lot better than he thought it would be. He's got a bunch of S and A rank stats, which is about the same as what Krena got, so he is satisfied with the results of all his efforts. Now that he's done with that, he decides to begin experimenting with his new abilities, and the first thing he wants to try is the enhanced skill, so he summons a Grasshopper card and uses the skill. The effects of the skill boost the stats of the Grasshopper directly, but it doesn't affect the buffs granted to Alan by extension. He decides to summon the Grasshopper to see what a boosted summon looks like in person, and as it appears, it glows for a few seconds to indicate that it has been boosted. Aside from that, not much else is different, but before Alan could test out anything else, his mother suddenly comes in to check on him, and as soon as she spots the Grasshopper, she freaks out and squishes it. The next morning, Gerda gets ready to go hunting, and while he's gone, Alan heads to the backyard to do a little more testing with his grimoire. He has attempted a bunch of different combinations in an attempt to unlock a new summon, but so far, nothing seems to be working, and he's done with his last pair of viable cards. Fortunately, this time, the fusion is successful, and he receives a new card, but he's not sure it's going to be useful, since its description says grass. On the bright side, it looks like the grass summon grants him an MP buff, so he can use it to increase the number of summons he can perform throughout the day. He then summons the grass card to find out what it's like, and an apple creature pops out, which leaves him even more confused than he was before. The apple doesn't have any combat skills, but it does possess a skill called Aroma, so Alan asks it to demonstrate, and it suddenly sinks into the ground before sprouting a stem. The stem does indeed have a wonderful aroma, but just then, Alan's mom comes to check on him again, and he tries to get the apple to hide itself, but it doesn't seem to be listening, so she ends up spotting the stem. Fortunately, she thinks it's just a regular stem, so she doesn't suspect anything, but Alan is still going to need to run a bunch of tests on this thing to figure out how it works. Later on in the day, Alan is training with Krena as usually, and even with the extra buffs from his level up, he is still no match for her strength. But Krena does notice that Alan has gotten a lot tougher. He is surprised to hear that, so he takes a look at his stats and realizes that his sword mastery stat is already at level 3 thanks to all the training he does with Krena, and he is really happy that his skill is improving. Now that he thinks about it, he also recently got a dog summon that has a bite attack, and he would love to try it out, but he doesn't think it would be fair to use it on Krena. After that, Alan spends the rest of the day throwing rocks at the tree in the backyard in hopes of awakening a new skill or something. But it hasn't been going well so far, so he's starting to feel like this is a huge waste of time. He also hasn't had a chance to do any other training since he has to look after his brother most of the time. Mash tells Alan that he's bored of throwing rocks at the tree, so Alan apologizes and says they can do something else after he gets a few more reps in. While Alan is preparing for his final tosses, Mash suddenly notices a bunch of saplings growing next to the house, and he is amazed since he doesn't recall seeing them there yesterday. Those saplings are the result of Alan activating a ton of apple summons at once for the MP buff, and thanks to the buff, he is able to fully restore his MP in 5 hours instead of the usual 6, so he can use over 15% more mana per day now. By nightfall, everyone gathers for dinner as usual, but Gerda isn't back from his hunt yet, which is really odd. Especially since they didn't intend to go deep into the forest today. Teresia is obviously worried, but she's trying to stay optimistic about the situation. However, all optimism goes out with Window and on CD. She hears the sounds of the panicked hunters carrying Roden's body back home. Roden was apparently injured during the hunt today, and just by looking at him, it's clear that he's lucky to be alive. He got hit by one of the boar's fangs in the gut, and while the other hunters managed to cauterize the wound to keep him alive, he's still on the verge of death. The only reason he even managed to last this long was thanks to the healing herb they gave him on the way here. Teresia is surprised to hear this since healing herb is really expensive, and she doesn't understand how they managed to get their hands on some. So Gerda explains that when the knight captain apologized for the way he treated them, part of the apology was a bag of gold coins, which is what they used to buy the herbs, but it wasn't enough to completely heal Roden. The other hunters all start yelling about how this whole thing is those commoners' fault, but all the noise wakes Mash up and makes him start crying. So Alan takes him back to bed, and the rest of the hunters decide to leave, to give the family some peace and quiet for now. Once everyone has calmed down, Alan asks about what happened, and if a commoner is really to blame for it all. Gerda explains that a few days ago, he and Roden were summoned by the village chief and told that they should allow the commoners to join them on their next hunt. Boar meat is a valuable commodity, and while most of it has to go to the Baron, the rest is split amongst the people involved in the hunt. They sometimes trade it for other goods, but aside from that, it's difficult to get any decent boat meat unless you hunt for it yourself. Despite this, no commoners have ever volunteered to be part of the hunts, and it's because it's an extremely dangerous task. There are casualties every year, and even more injuries, so for commoners usually avoid getting involved. But since Roden recently became famous as a legendary hunter, many commoners got the impression that as long as Roden was around, they could just let him handle dealing with the boar while they reaped the benefits afterwards, so they asked the chief to include them in the hunts. Roden and Gerda were against the idea, but they couldn't refuse an order from the chief, so they were forced to let the commoners join, and it went just as bad as they thought it would. During training sessions, all the commoners were slacking off, and when the time finally came for the hunt, the moment they actually came face to face with a boar, they all got scared and dropped their weapons as they ran away. This completely broke up the hunting party's formation, but as if that wasn't bad enough on its own, one of the commoners fell over while the boar was chasing him, so Roden instinctively stepped in to protect him, but he got skewered in the stomach as a result. The others eventually managed to slay the boar, so Gerda says he will bring the share of meat meant for Roden by tomorrow, but there's not much else he can do to help. And Alan feels like a total loser because up till now, he had been focusing on only leveling himself up instead of actually helping his family. By the next morning, Roden regains consciousness, and everyone is happy that he is alive, but Alan is still deep in thought. He had been treating this world like a game this entire time, but to the people that live here, this isn't a game. It's their reality, and they have to struggle to survive, so the least he could do is use his power to help them. A little while later, Gerda returns with Roden's share of the meat as promised, and he is relieved to see that Roden is awake, but he's still in terrible shape, so he's probably not going to be able to hunt anymore to prepare for winter. Gerda offers to share his stockpile with Roden and his family to help, and Roden appreciates it, but all of a sudden, Alan speaks up and tells everyone that he wants to take over for Roden. They can all tell that he's serious about it, so there are no objections, and later that morning, he gets to work by fetching some water from the well. The other men there warn him not to overdo it since that much water would be difficult for a child, but Alan is easily able to carry it home. Till now, he had been hiding the effects of his stat buffs, but with everyone already focusing their attention on Krena since she's an upcoming hero, it should be fine for him to stand out a bit. After he's done fetching water, he heads out into the fields with Gerda to harvest the potatoes. Gerda demonstrates the best method to pull the potatoes out of the ground, and he assumes Alan is going to struggle with it, but to his surprise, Alan is able to do it one-handed. He harvests 3 baskets of potatoes in no time, but after all that work, he realizes that more than half of these have to be given away to the Baron, and that's really unfair. He's trying to figure out how to get more food for his family, but all of a sudden, the chief shows up, and he's here to apologize to Roden. It was partially his fault that Roden ended up like this, so he wanted to make things right, and he also brought the guy who caused the accident to apologize as well. The guy doesn't seem like a bad person. He was just too scared to think straight back then, and he accepts full responsibility for the situation. Roden isn't really mad at him, but he tells the guy to be more careful next time, and he promises not to make the same mistake twice. Later on, Alan heads out into the fields and clears out a wide area because he came up with an idea. He summons a bunch of frogs and has them use their provoke skills to lure out some potential prey. However, instead of the few ducks that he was expecting, he actually ends up attracting a monster bird. At first, he thinks it's best to run away while he still can, but then he realizes that it would really help his family if he defeated the bird. Plus, he's got a bunch of stats boosts, so he thinks he should be strong enough to handle it and ends up deciding to attack. He runs in and whacks the bird across the head while it's not looking, and then he summons several dogs to attack it all at once. The dogs are doing a fair bit of damage, but unfortunately, the bird is too strong for them, so it takes them out, one after the other. It then goes after Alan, and since his summons have all been defeated, he has lost the majority of his buffs as well, so he is in serious danger here. He needs to act quickly if he doesn't want to end up as bird food, so when he gets the chance, he summons 2 leeches that start sucking on the bird's neck. Alan had never really tested them out before this, but thankfully, as expected, they seem to have an energy drain ability, so they can weaken the bird enough for him to stand a chance. Once they gets himself free, Alan summons even more leeches and wolves, and with their combined efforts, he is finally able to deal the finishing blow and defeat the monster. Alan can hardly believe it since this is his first kill, but his grimoire confirms that the bird is indeed dead, and he even received 100 XP as a reward. Later that day, Alan returns home with the bird, and his entire family is left speechless because they can't believe he actually managed to kill something like that. Alan tells them he just happened to catch it off guard while it was distracted, which is mostly true, but he did leave out the part about his summons. Gerda starts inspecting the bird's corpse because he is wondering how Alan managed to beat it with just a wooden sword and some rocks, but then he notices some bite marks on the bird and asks Alan about them. Alan makes up an excuse and says he was fighting on instinct, so he had to do whatever was necessary. And Gerda begins picturing Alan biting down on the bird for dear life. But regardless of how he pulled it off, it's still an impressive feat, so he congratulates him on a job well done. He even offers to help Alan bleed and dry the meat, since this is his first time. So they head over to the rack together. The Aldebaran weighs around 60 kilograms, but once it has been bled dry, it drops to around 20 kilos, and only around half of the bird's meat is actually edible. That said, the wings do fetch a pretty penny, and it does come with a magic stone, but at the end of the day, they still have to fork most of it up to the higher-ups. Alan thinks the whole 60% tax on all food thing is really unfair, and Gerda agrees with him, but there's nothing they can do about it. At least that would normally be the case, but since Alan's situation is a bit unique, they might be able to negotiate the chief into letting them keep more than usual. A little while later, both Alan and Gerda head to the chief's office to tell him about the bird Alan caught, and the chief is very pleased. But then Gerda suggests that Alan should only hand over the wings as tax and keep the rest for himself. This catches the chief off guard, and he tries to explain that they can't do that because the Baron has requested more food than usual this year. But then Gerda reminds the chief that the only reason Alan was forced to go out and hunt was because of his unreasonable demand that led to Roden getting injured. At this rate, Alan's family might actually starve since they barely have enough to eat, and to really sell the story, Alan acts like he's going to faint from hunger on the spot. The chief feels really guilty, but he's still hesitant to cut Alan's taxes, so to sweeten the deal a little, Gerda offers to throw in the bird's magic stone. The chief eventually agrees to the deal, and Alan and Gerda are really happy to hear that. But they aren't done yet, because Alan asks if this means he can keep all the meat aside from the wings with any future birds he catches. The chief is once again hesitant to agree, but Gerda reminds him that it's pretty rare for a kid to catch an Aldebaran all on his own, so what are the odds of it happening again? The chief eventually agrees to let Alan keep most of the meat of any of his future catches under the assumption that he won't be able to catch another bird anytime soon, but he was wrong. Later on, Alan heads back out into the fields, and this time, he manages to lure in 2 Aldebarans at once. By now, he has gotten the strategy down pat, so he sends out the leeches first to weaken the birds, and after that, he throws some rocks at their heads to disorient them. Next, he orders his wolves to attack with full force, and after they've whittled down the birds' health, he whacks them over the head with his sword to finish them off. Alan has been going on hunts every 3 days for a while now, but this is the first time he has ever managed to succeed without losing a single one of his summons, so he's really pleased with himself. And to make it even better, he has finally gained enough XP to go up to level 2. He excitedly opens his status screen so he can see how much his stats went up, and it looks like he got a 60% boost to his stats, which is a little less than what he was expecting. But it's still a huge increase, so he's happy regardless. It took him 6 years to go up 1 level, but now that it has finally happened, he thinks it's about time that he lets his family know the truth about him. A little while later, he returns home with both of the birds, and his father is amazed that he managed to catch 2 of them at once. But he also notices that there's something different about Alan today. However, Alan still has a bunch of other things to do, including his sparring session with Krena, so he leaves before Roden gets a chance to say much. After today's haul, Alan has officially captured 10 birds total, so his family should be able to use that to make it through the winter. He would like to keep hunting birds to see if he can make it to level 3, but he doubts he would be able to find that many birds in time. Thanks to his stat boost, Alan can keep up with Krena a lot easier now. But he got distracted by his thoughts for a moment, and that was enough time for her to sneak up from behind and smack him on the head. Later that night, Alan calls a meeting with his family, and once they are all present, he informs them that he isn't actually talentless. He can't reveal the exact details, but he basically explains that when he was a baby, he received an oracle from the god Elmia, and that means he is smarter and stronger than the average person, but he's also going to have to work 100 times harder than normal to grow stronger. His parents believe him, but they are devastated because it sounds a lot like Alan was cursed, and they aren't wrong, but it was actually self-inflicted when he chose to play on Hell mode. Alan also tells them that the only reason he was appraised as talentless was because his talent was too new to be recognized. His parents are amazed to hear that and ask if this means Alan really does have a talent, but he tells them he doesn't know what it is yet. He thought about revealing the fact that he's a summoner at first, but he eventually decided not to, because he doesn't know how people will react once they find out that he can summon and control living creatures. Even though they don't know what Alan's talent is, they are relieved to find out that he is talented, because now it makes sense why he spent so much time throwing rocks at trees and hunting monsters, but they wish he would have told them sooner. Roden asks Alan what he plans to do from now on, and Alan says he's going to continue doing his best to grow stronger, so his dad reminds him that he should feel free to ask for help if he needs it. But in the meantime, he probably shouldn't mention this to anyone else, because it would be really bad if he were mistaken for a false prophet. Though, it's probably fine to talk to Gerda about it since he isn't a snitch, and Roden really wants to brag to him about how amazing Alan is. The next day, the first winter snow hits, so it's time for Alan to start bartering with the bird meat he stocked up on, and Gerda is coming along to show him the ropes. Gerda plans to trade in some of the boar meat he stocked up on before the winter. Fortunately, there haven't been any more accidents since. As long as there are no commoners to mess things up, the hunts usually go pretty smoothly, but hearing that gets Alan thinking, and he wonders what the difference is between serfs like him and Gerda, and the commoners. Gerda explains that commoners have a higher social standing than serfs, and the taxes they pay are also a bit different. Whereas serfs have to pay 60% of all the food they make as taxes, commoners only have to pay a head tax, meaning they pay 1 gold coin per person each year. Alan asks if it's possible for a serf to become a commoner, and Gerda explains that it is indeed possible, but you'd need to pay a tribute of 10 gold coins in order to do so. Alan does some quick math, and since his mom has another baby on the way, he would need to pay 50 gold coins for all of them to become commoners, which is a lot of money, but he's going to make it happen sooner or later. Alan spends the rest of the day shadowing Gerda to learn how much his bird meat is worth in the barter system, and by day 2, he has a decent enough understanding of it to make the trip on his own. A bag of salt costs him around 5 pieces of jerky, and that same bag of salt would be worth 5 silver coins, so 1 piece of meat is worth 1 silver coin. With the currency system, 1 gold coin is worth around 100 silver coins, So if Alan wants to save up 50 gold coins for his family, then he is going to need to hunt for the equivalent of 500 pieces of the Aldebaran meat. That seems like a lot, but Alan is sure he can get it done within a few years. For his next stop, Alan heads to the local potion store and asks if they have any MP recovery potions. The store clerk tells Alan he doesn't sell anything that fancy, so Alan asks if he has any healing herbs in stock instead. Hearing Alan mention the healing herb strikes a nerve with the store clerk because he got a bad deal last time he sold one. He recalls that a guy named Gerda came in here, begging to buy some healing herb to save his buddy. It usually costs 5 gold coins, but Gerda only had 3 at the time, so he begged the store clerk to give him a discount and promised to pay it back later. Gerda seems so desperate that the clerk decided to help him out, and to his credit, he did come back to pay the balance later. But the clerk was really worried that he might have gotten scammed at the time. Alan knows that his father wouldn't have survived if the clerk hadn't agreed to give Gerda a discount that day, so he thanks him for his kindness and offers him a piece of bird meat as a gift. Later on, Alan is walking through the streets when he spots a weapons shop, and he is surprised that a single weapon can cost as much as 50 gold on its own. But while he's minding his own business, all of a sudden, Dagora comes out of nowhere and picks a fight with him. He tries to assert dominance and convince Alan to become his minion, but Alan isn't going to let that kind of disrespect slide, so he sets his baggage down and pulls out his wooden sword before pointing it at Dagora. Now, he could beat Dagora's ass right now and be done with it, but he wants this to be a fair ass whooping, so he tells Dagora to go get himself a weapon. Dagora accepts the challenge and runs off to get his club, and he thinks he's got the upper hand, but Alan is a lot more skilled when it comes to combat thanks to his training with Krena, so he easily mops the floor with Dagora. Long story short, by spring, Dagora starts coming over to Alan's house so Alan can train him, but he's still a long way off from being able to compete. Mash has also begun training with Krena, but she's taking it a lot easier on him than she would with Alan since he's still new to combat. While Alan is watching the two of them, Dagora tries to sneak attack him, but Alan's reflexes are too quick for that, so he ends up falling over and hurting his knee in the process. That night, Roden and Gerda return, and they've got some bad news because they were just in a meeting with the village chief, and he says the Baron wants them to deliver 15 boars instead of the usual 10 this year. He is also demanding that they allow the commoners to hunt with them again this year, but after what happened last time, Roden and Gerda were wholeheartedly against it. Even so, they can't go against a direct order from the Baron, so they have no choice but to let it happen and hope for the best. Just then, Alan speaks up and tells everyone he has a plan. The reason having commoners join the hunt is a problem is because they are pretty much useless, but he has countless hours of experience in every MMO imaginable, and he is confident he can make even the most hopeless newbie useful to the team, so he asks to be put in charge of training the commoners before the hunts. When the time for the next hunt finally arrives, Roden takes Alan to meet with the other hunters and tells them that he would like to use one of Alan's hunting strategies for today, but he makes it clear that Alan is just here to watch for the day, so he won't be doing any fighting. Alan already agreed to this arrangement, but he is a little disappointed that his dad won't let him fight since he was looking forward to leveling up, but Roden wouldn't budge on it, so he might as well just take what he can get. The most important thing for this trip is that they train the newbies enough so they can handle themselves, because he wouldn't want a repeat of what happened last time. Speaking of last time, the guy that was responsible for getting Roden hurt comes up to him to apologize again, and he tells Roden that if anything bad happens today, he doesn't need to put himself at risk just to protect him. Roden tells the kid that all he needs to do is focus on fulfilling his role, and if he can do that, then hopefully nothing will go wrong. With that, the hunt team heads out into the forest to search for their prey, and this is technically the first time Alan has been allowed to leave the village walls to go into the forest, so he is really excited. Once they make it out into the forest, Gerda reminds everyone of the plan and tells them to get into their positions. A few of the newbies act as bait to lure out a boar, and once the boar comes running out of the brush, it is intercepted by Gerda and his squad. After they've successfully stopped the boar, Roden and the others come running in from the sides and stab it over and over. This is the strategy that Roden and the others have successfully used to hunt for the past 10 years, but it doesn't work very well with spineless newbies, which is why Alan suggested a little change. While the others will still do most of the work taking the boar down, the newbies will stand off to the side so they don't get in their way, and when the time is right, Alan tells them to go stab the boar along with the others. With the way experience works in this world, they just need to deal a little damage to the boar to receive XP from it, so this should help them level up. The boys do as Alan instructed, and sure enough, as the boar is defeated, they feel a sudden surge of power flow through their bodies, meaning they must have passed the trial of the gods, or in other words, They just leveled up. Alan is really glad that his plan worked as intended, but unfortunately, he didn't get to enjoy any of that free XP since he didn't land any hits on the boar. The next day, Alan is over by the well with a few of the older guys when he hears that one of them has been focusing on butchering meat instead of hunting, since his wife is pregnant and he wants to play it safe. And since that's the case, Alan asks him for a little favor. He leads the man back to his house and shows him the set of Aldebarans that he recently captured. The man is amazed that such a little kid was able to catch so many birds, but Alan explains that he has a bit of a problem. He can't handle butchering all these birds on his own, so he was hoping the man would help him out a little, and in exchange, Alan is willing to give him 2 packs of meat per bird butchered. The man is more than willing to help since it's a really good deal for him, but he asks Alan if he's really okay with giving out so much meat as payment. Alan assures him that it's fine, and the reason he's okay with it is because these birds aren't part of his family's food reserves. Alan caught these birds specifically so he could sell them to earn the 50 gold coins he needs to raise his family's status. Later that day, Alan is back out in the forest with the hunting group, and they've got a few extra newbies with them today. The plan is to gradually expand the group until they have enough people to make 2 groups to hunt twice the amount of boar like the Baron wanted. But Alan is still a little curious about why the Baron is so interested in increasing the amount of boar captured since it's not like there's a food shortage or anything. Just then, a boar comes charging out of the forest, so all the hunters prepare themselves, and just like last time, after the boar has been brought under control, the newbies are called over to join in for the finishing blow. Just like last time, the newbies all level up from the free experience they gained, but thanks to some quick thinking from Alan, he also managed to reap the benefits of the kill. All he had to do was send out one of his grasshoppers and let it be squished by the boar to technically make himself a participant of the battle, and it worked out just as he hoped it would since he managed to make it to level 3, but he does feel a little guilty for sacrificing one of his summons like that. 3 months later, Alan and the others are invited to go to the chief's mansion to celebrate the start of a new year, and now that the party is over, he and Krena are walking back home. Krena is really happy since they got a lot of free candy, but Alan assumes that was just a reward for meeting the 15 boar quota. They eventually return home and meet up with their families, as they are about to throw a New Year's celebration of their own, and as they all dig in, Roden begins praising Alan for his genius idea to safely integrate the newbies into the hunting parties, and thanks to that, they should have no trouble meeting the 20 boar quota next year. As they continue to talk, Gerda happens to notice a bottle behind Alan, so he asks what it is, and Alan explains that he received a bottle of liquor from the chief as a gift earlier. Gerda and Roden are really excited to hear this because they've been looking forward to getting to drink, but Alan reminds them that the liquor was personally given to him, so they can't have it unless he says so. This is all part of his plan to get them to let him fight during the hunts, so he says he will only let them have it if they can beat him in a game. Roden and Gerda are really desperate for that liquor, so they agree to Alan's terms and ask what game he wants to play, to which Alan answers that he wants to arm wrestle. Gerda and Roden are fine with that, but before the game begins, Alan asks them what they are going to give him if he wins because he needs some kind of reward for his effort. Roden can tell that Alan already has something in mind, so he asks him to just tell them what it is, and that's when Alan explains that he just wants them to let him fight in future hunts. Roden doesn't like the idea, but he sees no harm in playing along since he's sure he's going to win anyway, so he and Gerda get ready to arm wrestle with Alan. First up is Gerda, and he seems pretty confident that he won't lose a contest of strength against a 7-year-old, but unfortunately for him, Alan has stocked up on every strength buff available with his summons, so as the match begins, Alan matches Gerda's strength and eventually manages to overpower him. Gerda can't believe he lost, but Roden kind of expected as much considering all the amazing things Alan has been doing lately, but he is still confident that Alan won't be able to beat him like he did with Gerda, so after a short break, Roden locks arms with Alan. Just like with Gerda, Alan matches Roden's strength at first, but this time, Alan actually ends up getting overpowered and losing. He assumes Gerda must have strength somewhere around D rank, which means Roden's must be around C rank, so it makes sense he couldn't win. As promised, he hands over the liquor, but he swears he will get strong enough to beat Roden someday. Later that year, Alan finally manages to level up his summoning skills again, and now he's got access to a bunch of E-rank summons. He's still going to need to do some experimenting to figure out what kind of summons he's got now, but he has more than enough MP to spare for a few tests. The level of buffs provided by E-rank summons is bound to be stronger than that of the F-rank ones, so Alan is certain he would be able to beat Roden in arm wrestling now. But before he could run off to go challenge his dad, he notices an extra feature in his grimoire, and it says, Storage. Alan taps the icon and his grimoire opens to a page with a black square on it, so he assumes this must be the storage skill in question. He decides to test it out by throwing a rock inside to see how deep it is, but after the rock goes in, he doesn't hear it hit the bottom. He reaches his hand in to see if he can feel the inside of the storage space, and as he does so, he gets a mental image of the rock he threw in earlier. He decides to try throwing even more things inside, and basically, as long as it can fit through the opening in the book, there is no limit to how much the space can store. But this seems a little too broken to be a random skill he unlocked, so he has a lot of questions. After all, something like infinite storage is a top-tier skill, so he really doubts the devs would go handing it out without a reason. Most of the time, whenever you receive a useful-looking item or skill, it is usually because you're going to need to use it in the near future. So Alan needs to figure out what the intended use is supposed to be. That aside, he also wants to try out his new E-rank summons, so he tries calling one out, but nothing happens. Alan is surprised that it didn't work since he's sure he has enough MP for the summon, but that's when the system informs him that he will need E-rank magic stones in order to summon an E-rank monster. He had no idea he would need magic stones for this, but as luck would have it, he just so happens to have a stash of magic stones he got from killing a few rabbit monsters around the village, so after retrieving them, he heads outside and tries to summon the E-rank insect again, but it still doesn't work. This is when he recalls the storage space and decides to try throwing the magic stones in there to activate the summon, and that seems to do the trick. So Alan is able to summon a beautiful butterfly, although it's a lot bigger than he thought it would be. Just then, Alan's mother comes over to check on him, and considering how squeamish she gets around bugs, Alan doesn't want to risk finding out what will happen if she spots a giant butterfly, so he hides behind his back while making up an excuse to keep her from getting suspicious. He then decides to head out into the fields to try out his next summon, and it's a good thing he did because the summon turned out to be a saber-toothed tiger, and it's really scary in person. He then tries to fuse the butterfly and the tiger to see what he will get, but nothing really happens. He then tries throwing a few more magic stones into storage, and that seemed to do the trick, but he's going to need a lot more magic stones if he wants to try more summons. Later that night, while having dinner, he asks his dad if there are any more rabbit monsters in the village, but Roden tells him all the rabbits are gone. They dug a ditch around the village a few years back to get rid of most of them since they are pretty dangerous to have around kids, but if all the rabbits are really gone, then Alan is going to need to find another way to gather magic stones. The next day, during training, he decides to ask Palomas about magic stones, and he is informed that they are mostly used to power magic items, but the E-rank ones are seen as practically useless, so it's pretty common to just find them scattered across the ground. Alan hadn't even considered the possibility that he could find the magic stones on the ground, but now that he does know, he's got a lot of scavenging to do. A little while later, Alan has managed to gather enough magic stones to unlock all his new summons, and he can already imagine how powerful he will become if he keeps progressing. Because his summon ability allows him to fill out all the roles of an average party all on his own, so with countless beasts at his disposal, he will be unstoppable. A little while later, the chief invites Roden, Gerda, and Alan to dinner and informs them that the Baron apparently intends to pay the village a visit next month. He says he wants to watch the boar hunting, which annoys Gerda a lot because the Baron has already put them through enough stress with his boar quota increases. Roden says he has no problem with the Baron watching the hunts, but he doesn't understand why Alan was called to deliver such news, and that's when the chief reveals that he was actually hoping Alan would act as the tour guide for the Baron while he's in town. Alan personally doesn't like the idea of having to entertain the Baron, but at the rate he's going, it will take him close to 10 years to hunt enough birds to grant his family commoner status, and that's way too long. However, if he manages to impress the Baron enough, he might be able to earn a promotion from him, so he decides to do it. A month later, Baron Granville arrives in the village along with his daughter, Cecil, and Knight Captain Zenov, and they are brought back to the chief's house for lunch. First of all, Granville apologizes for making such an unreasonable request with the boar meat last year, but he simply couldn't refuse a direct order from the king. The chief is shocked to hear that the boar quota increase came from the king himself, but Granville clarifies that the real culprit behind it was Viscount Carnal, because he intentionally called attention to the boar meat in front of the king to goad him into making the order. A little while later, the food is served, and both Granville and Cecil are amazed by how delicious the meat is, so Granville asks the chief what the dish is called, but the chief has no idea how to respond, so Alan cuts in and explains that the meat is from a bird he hunted and prepared yesterday, specifically, so the Baron would have the freshest ingredients for his meal. Granville is impressed by how well-mannered Alan is, so he asks if he is the chief's son, but Zenov remembers meeting him last time he was in the village and recognizes him as the son of Roden, the renowned boar slayer. The Baron is impressed by Alan's manners and asks if he happens to come from a family of former knights, but the chief explains that Alan and his family are just serfs. As soon as Cecil hears this, she becomes outraged that the chief would let a filthy serf set foot in the guest hall, but her father scolds her and tells her serfs are valued members of the fiefdom, so she can't go around treating them like trash. Cecil apologizes for what she said, but now she's mad at Alan for some reason, and he can already tell that she's going to be a pain in his ass later. Fortunately, unlike his daughter, the Baron seems like a reasonable person, so when Alan explains that he is going to be in charge of showing them around during tomorrow's hunt, he thanks him for volunteering and says he looks forward to it. Zenov mentions that if the 20 boar quota proves too difficult for them to manage, he can have his knight take over the hunts, and Granvelle thinks that's a good idea since he doesn't want to overburden them. But Alan interjects and tells them that won't be necessary, because they are more than capable of meeting the quota on their own. The following morning, the Baron's carriage has been prepared, and he is entrusting Zenov with protecting Cecil should anything go wrong during the expedition. Before long, they set out into the forest, and upon arrival, Alan shows them to a tower prepared in advance so they can watch the boar hunt from a safe distance. Alan leads them all into the tower's perch, and Cecil really seems to be enjoying the view because she has never seen so many trees before. A few moments later, Roden and the rest of the warriors arrive, and Granvelle is impressed to see that they've acquired armor. Alan explains that they put the boar hide from the previous year's hunts to good use, creating all sorts of tools and equipment to make the boar hunts go smoother. As the hunt begins, Granvelle notices a few warriors who aren't wearing any armor run into the forest alone, so Alan explains that those guys are in charge of luring the boars out of the forest and into the hunting grounds. Though they will probably have to be patient if they want to see any action since luring the boars out takes quite a while. While they wait, Zenov asks Alan how Krena has been doing lately, and Alan tells him she has been doing great. Zenov is glad to hear that and informs Alan that he will be dispatching a tutor to prepare her for the academy entrance exams in spring. And Alan can't help but chuckle because he thinks it will be funny to see Krena study for a change. A few moments later, the luring team returns with a boar hut on their trail, and everyone gets into position. Using a couple boar hide shields they made, they box the boar in, and Alan explains that the shields are made from the hardest part of the boar's hide to make it penetration-proof. After locking the boar in place, the strike team moves in and begins stabbing it from the side while the long spear team, comprised of the most inexperienced members of the group, also join in to aid the attack. But Cecil wasn't prepared for how gory a boar hunt really is, so she's starting to feel sick at the sight of all the blood. Roden then finishes the boar off with a blow to the neck, and it's so gruesome that it causes Cecil to pass out on the spot. Everyone begins to celebrate once the boar is dead, and both Granvelle and Zenov are greatly important the fighting prowess of these warriors. However, a moment later, another loud roar is heard from the forest as two boars come charging at the group, and Zenov thinks this is really bad, so he orders his knights to be ready to jump in if necessary. But Alan tells him that the knights' assistance won't be needed here because the hunting squad is perfectly capable of handling two boars at once. Roden orders the team to split into two groups to handle the boars separately, and Alan thinks to himself that a few years ago, it would have been impossible for them to handle a situation like this. The main reason is because they always had to give away 60% of their hunt as taxes, so instead of making any equipment with the materials gotten from the boars, they were forced to trade everything away to get by. However, with efficient hunting strategy, they've managed to gain more leeway when it comes to their allocation of materials, and with the improved equipment, they are more than capable of handling two at once. Within a few minutes, the remaining boars are dealt with, and Cecil regains consciousness just in time to see the blood geyser from one of the boars, which promptly knocks her out again. Granvelle is impressed that they managed to take down 3 boars in just one day because that means they only have to hunt 17 more to fill the quota. But Alan corrects him and explains that they only actually need 10 more, because before Granvelle decided to pay them a visit, they had already captured 7 other boars. The Baron is glad to hear that because it means the quota won't be as much of a burden on the village as he had thought, and while the Baron is in a good mood, Alan tells him he has a few requests to make. He says he would like permission to create a few more shields out of the boar hide to help with future hunts, and the Baron has no objections to that. But Alan's second request is to ask for permission to trade for liquor outside the village. Once again, the Baron isn't necessarily opposed to the idea, but he wonders why Alan is asking for liquor specifically. Alan explains that since filling the quota has required them to hunt for more meat than they otherwise would, there have been concerns that the influx of extra meat would cause a crash in the overall value of the meat locally, which is why he wants permission to trade a good portion of it for alcohol to boost morale. Granvelle sees no reason to object, So he agrees to the requests and tells Alan that he has done a wonderful job as a guide today. As they are preparing to leave for the day, Cecil, who had been quiet for most of the hunt, yells at Alan and tells him not to get full of himself just because her father praised him a little. But as she says this, she nearly falls off her horse, which completely ruins the intimidating act she was trying to put on. A little while later, Alan, Roden, and Gerda are all called over to Granville's mansion, and Granville tells them that he was so impressed with their performance the other day that he wants to give them a reward. Alan is excited because he can already tell what's coming, and a few moments later, Granville declares that Roden and Gerda, along with all their families, will be granted commoner status. Roden and Gerda can't believe it since they never expected something like this to happen, and Alan is overjoyed because now he gets to keep all that money he was saving. And he's allowed to leave the village without permission now, so the first thing he plans to do is head to the White Dragon Mountains when he gets the chance. Granville also adds that anyone who has participated in the hunts over the past 10 years will receive the same promotion, so he asks Roden and Gerda to provide a list of everyone who qualifies. After everything Granville has seen, he knows there should be no problems with fulfilling the quota requirements, so he says he can return to the capital and rest easy. However, his butler reminds him that there's actually one more thing he needs to do. It nearly skipped Granville's mind, but the king apparently wants to use Krena village as an example to the other villages in the kingdom since they have been doing so well lately. So he asks Roden to tell him the backstory of how the hunts began. Roden looks a bit uncomfortable after hearing this, so Gerda explains to Granville that the village's backstory is a bit of a sensitive subject for Roden, so he offers to recount the details in Roden's place. Gerda explains that around 13 years ago, 100 serfs moved onto the land as part of the king's reclamation decree, and they worked hard for 3 months to make the place livable, but just when things were finally starting to go their way, they were attacked by a giant boar, which destroyed all the food they had stored up for winter. There was no way they would survive till the next year if they didn't do something, so Roden suggested that they should try hunting the boar for meat, and everyone agreed with him. They didn't have any weapons or equipment at the time. They attacked the boar with nothing but shovels and hoes, and miraculously, they were eventually able to defeat it. Granville is impressed by the story, but he doesn't understand why Roden is so sensitive about it since it sounds like his initiative is what led to the boar hunts that made the village prosper. However, Gerda informs him that during that hunt, one of Roden's close friends ended up dying, and Roden has blamed himself for it ever since. Granville understands how Roden must feel, and to make up for bringing up such a painful memory, he tells Roden he is allowed to make any request he wants. Alan thinks this is great and tells Roden he can ask for some high-quality liquor, but instead, Roden asks the Baron to allow Alan to work on his estate, even if only as a simple hallboy. Alan internally freaks out after hearing this, because if he gets employed at the Baron's estate, he will have even less freedom than he already does, so he is hoping the Baron refuses Roden's request. But to his dismay, Granville actually says Alan is too good to be a mere hallboy, so he will employ him as a fully fledged servant of the estate. Cecil is outraged by this since she can't believe a filthy serf is going to be allowed into the mansion, but her butler reminds her that Alan isn't a serf anymore because he was just promoted to a commoner. Alan really wants to find a way to back out of this, but Finn's Roden seems really happy about the whole thing, so he would feel bad if he ruined it by turning down the offer now. The next day, Alan gets dressed for his first day as a servant at the Baron's estate, and though his family is happy for him, they are also really sad to see him go. Krena is especially upset about not getting to see Alan again, so Alan suggests they should spar one more time before he leaves, and that seems to cheer her up. As their battle begins, everyone watches expecting Krena to dominate Alan as usual, but this time, Alan dumped all his stat boosts into agility, and it made him quick enough to keep up with and even outpace Krena despite her being a sword lord. Eventually, Alan wins the duel by holding his sword to Krena's neck, and she's in shock because this is the first time she has ever lost, but Alan says they can just call this a draw, and they'll have a rematch in the future to decide the real winner. The time soon comes for Alan to leave, so everyone starts saying their goodbyes, and even Dagora shows up to give Alan a knife as a present before he leaves the village. After that, Alan's parents both walk Alan to the village gate, and along the way, Roden tells Alan that being a servant is only the first step for him, and if he works hard, he will definitely move up in life. They eventually arrive the gate where the chief has already prepared a carriage to take Alan, Cecil, and the Baron back to the city. It's a little awkward in the carriage since Cecil won't even look at him, and he has nothing to say to Granville, but he's going to find a way to make it work. Thus, Alan's life as a servant at the Baron's estate officially begins, and since he's a similar age to Cecil, he is put in charge of taking care of her, which basically means he is required to listen to all her demands, no matter how unreasonable they may be. For example, she asks Alan to carry her on his shoulders so she can reach some fruit that's up in a tree, but after she gets the fruit, she realizes it tastes awful and blames Alan for not warning her about it sooner. She's not a bad person, but she's really annoying to have to deal with all day, though Alan can't say anything about it since that would be disrespectful. She tells Alan to go buy some delicious fruit from the market for her, and Alan agrees to do so, but just then, he notices a giant ship flying overhead, and he is amazed because he had no idea that this world had stuff like this. Cecil doesn't understand why Alan is so shocked and asks if this is his first time seeing a magic airship, but Alan really hasn't seen one of these before. So she decides to leave him be and just reminds him to buy the fruit for her once he's done here. The next morning, Alan wakes up in his living quarters, and while it may look like an old attic room, well, actually, it is an old attic, but it's still a bit of an upgrade from Alan's old room. He has used his summoning skills to grow some grass plants with recovery-boosting aroma, so he always starts his days feeling fresh and energized. That said, he's still really hungry, so he decides to head downstairs for breakfast. In the dining hall, all the other servants are already eating, and over the past few days of working here, Alan has gotten to know them pretty well, especially the head servant, Rickle. When Rickle sees Alan, he asks him if he has been getting along well with Cecil, and Alan says yes, but Rickle can tell by looking at his face that she's been rough on him. He explains Cecil is only asking so much of him because he's a servant instead of a hallboy, but Alan has no idea what the difference is. Rickle explains that servants of the family are split into senior and junior ranks, but they are all still technically considered to be part of the family. However, hallboys are different because they are only temporary helpers of the family, so they aren't considered members of the family. Alan is surprised because he had no idea that becoming a servant here made him a member of the family, though now that he thinks about it, it does make sense why his dad was so overjoyed when the Baron made the offer. Later that day, Alan and a few other servants serve the Baron's family breakfast, and the Baron's wife is quite impressed by how well-mannered Alan is despite his humble upbringing. The Baron is also impressed that Alan is so skilled despite the fact that he is talentless, and though the part about him being talentless isn't true, Alan decides to just go along with it. As soon as Cecil finds out that Alan is talentless, she begins bragging about how she has the wizardess talent and her older brother has the swordsman talent. But Cecil's father yells at her to stop bragging about talent in front of her brother because it's a sensitive topic for him. Cecil's younger brother, Thomas, has always felt inferior because he doesn't have a talent. So hearing Cecil brag about it like that made him tear up, and Cecil feels really guilty for making him upset, but she still somehow finds a way to blame Alan for it. Later on, Alan has the afternoon off from work, so he decides to head into town, and his first stop is the Adventurers Guild because that's his #1 goal. He walks up to the front desk and asks the receptionist if he can register as an adventurer here. She explains that she can help him register, but first she needs to ask how old he is. Alan informs her that he is 8 years old, but unfortunately, she tells him that the minimum age to register as an adventurer is 12, so he isn't allowed to become one. Alan is devastated to hear this since he doesn't want to have to continue being a servant for 4 years, but since there's nothing else he can do for today, he decides to head to the notice board to gather some intel. At the board, he notices all kinds of monsters with different ranks posted with bounties, but a few moments later, an adventurer named Raven walks up to him and says this isn't a place for a kid like Alan, so he had better leave. Alan apologizes and agrees to leave, but before he does, he asks Raven why bounties are organized that way. Raven explains that monsters get stronger the further away from the city you get, so naturally, some of the strongest monsters are located in the White Dragon Mountain. Alan then notices a really old bounty on the wall of the White Dragon, so he asks why no one has taken it out yet even though the reward is so good. Raven explains that the White Dragon is simply way too strong for anyone to beat, but there's a ton of mithril growing in that area. So there are still tons of requests for it, and the bounty keeps getting higher and higher. All that information was really helpful. So Alan thanks Raven and heads on his way. He can't register himself as an adventurer yet, but that doesn't mean he can't fight monsters. And since this is his day off, he plans to make the most of it. He runs straight to the city gate, where he is stopped by a guard. Normally, people aren't allowed to leave the city without permission, but since Alan is technically a member of the Granville family, he is allowed to use their seal as identification, and that pretty much grants him access to wherever he wants to go. As soon as the guard opens the gate, he rushes out into the forest so he can start hunting monsters, but he doesn't want to be too careless, so he decides to start slow. Since monsters get stronger the farther into the forest you go, he only walks a few kilometers out so the monsters in the area will have an average of D rank. Once he arrives at an ideal location, Alan summons a hawk, and since the hawk has high intelligence, it is smart enough to understand Alan's commands. So he summons 5 more and orders them to fly into the air and track down any monsters in the area. While he's waiting for the hawks to find something, he decides to evaluate the intelligence of his tiger summon, but while it is obedient to him, it doesn't really understand Alan's commands, so it can only do so much. Just then, a hawk comes back to inform Alan that it has located a few monsters, and after following the hawk, Alan is led to a horde of goblins. The goblins notice him hiding behind a tree, so they all rush out to attack him, but Alan was prepared for this and summons 10 tigers to surround them. And for good measure, he summons a butterfly to cast a sleep spell on the goblins to make it easier to finish them off. Killing goblins doesn't earn him as much XP as killing a boar would, but a key benefit here is the fact that taking the goblins out is a lot quicker than taking a boar out, so Alan can farm them to his heart's content. By nightfall, Alan has hunted around 80 goblins, earning himself 16,000 experience points and allowing him to go up by 2 levels. He is really pleased with how his day off went, because not only did he level up, he also learned a lot about his summons. For example, the butterfly's sleep spell has an 80% chance of successfully putting a goblin to sleep, and D-rank magic stones can't be used to create E-rank summons, even though they are more valuable. Anyway, even though it's late, Alan wants to keep farming, so he asks the hawks to go look for more monsters to fight, but they all just kind of stare at him without moving. Alan asks what's wrong, and that's when he finds out that the hawks aren't capable of seeing well at night, so they won't be able to scout monsters for him anymore. That's a huge bummer for Alan since he still wanted to hunt a little more, but he's got bigger problems to deal with right now, because he was planning to rely on the hawks to help him find his way back to the city. And if they can't see anything in the dark, then that means he is pretty much lost in the woods, but he can't spend the night out here, so he is forced to stumble through the dark until he eventually makes it back home. A month later, Alan commissions a blacksmith to make 3 metal balls for him since he has been meaning to find a way to make his rock-throwing skill more effective, and these are perfect. So after paying for the balls, he tosses them into his grimoire's storage. Over the past month, Alan has gone hunting 4 times, and thanks to his successful XP farming sessions, his level has risen all the way to 12, so he finally feels like he is making some progress. Later that night, he returns to the Granville estate, but as soon as he walks in, he is cornered by Sebas and told that the Baron wants to have a word with him. Alan heads to the Baron's office to meet with him, and he begins praising Alan because ever since he arrived, the others in the mansion have had nothing but good things to say about him. However, the Baron is a little concerned about what Alan does on his days off because he has been told that Alan leaves early in the morning and does not return until late into the night. Of course, the Baron tells Alan that he isn't in trouble because he is free to do whatever he wants with his days off, but he just wants to have an idea of what Alan is up to. Alan understands why the Baron would be suspicious of his behavior, so he decides to be completely honest and explains that he has been hunting in the forest on his days off. The Baron asks why Alan is doing it, so Alan explained that as the son of a hunter like Roden, it is simply natural for him to want to hunt as well. The Baron can't argue with that, so he tells Alan he is free to continue hunting as much as he wants. However, there is one condition. Sebas assumes that Alan must be hunting E-rank rabbits since he doesn't know he is strong enough to handle D-rank goblins, so he tells Alan that he cannot sell the meat he catches to any of the local butchers since it could cause a scandal if it became public knowledge. Instead, Sebas offers to have the estate buy any meat Alan hunts at 1 silver coin per bundle, which is higher than the current market rate. Alan is overjoyed by this news, especially since till now, he had just been throwing away all the meat he gathered, so this will give him a chance to earn a little extra money. 6 months later, Alan is out in the forest on one of his weekly hunts, and today, he plans to kill at least 100 goblins and a few horned rabbits to bring back to the mansion. Just then, one of his hawks returns, and he assumes this must mean it has found more monsters, but then a moment later, the rest of the hawks return as well, and they all seem to be acting pretty strange, so Alan realizes something must be wrong. He decides to follow the hawks, even though he has no idea where they are leading him. But a moment later, he comes across Raven and his party in deep trouble against a horde of goblins. Raven is already down for the count, and with Rita being the only other fighter on the team, the situation isn't looking good for them, so Alan decides to join in to help. He throws his metal balls at a few of the goblins, but while it does a lot more damage than throwing stones does, it isn't enough to kill them outright, and he only had 3 pieces of ammo, so it wasn't as effective as he had hoped. Normally, he would be able to handle the goblins effortlessly by summoning a few tigers, but he doesn't want to use his powers in front of other people yet, so he is going to have to get his hands dirty. He charges at one of the goblins, and since he is level 12 now, he is a lot stronger than he used to be, so he can easily handle a D-rank goblin on his own without help from his summons. He then proceeds to take out a few more goblins in the time that it takes Rita to kill one, and thanks to him, they are safe, but Raven's life is still in danger here. Rita begs Milsey to hurry up and heal Raven, but unfortunately, Milsey is already out of mana, so she can't use any more healing spells. With his current state, Raven won't survive long enough to make it back to town, so Alan offers to use some of the healing grass he made with his summon, and with it, Raven's wound is completely healed. The others are overjoyed to see Raven wake up, and they all swear that they will repay Alan for the valuable healing herb he used on them. But Alan really doesn't want to draw too much attention to himself, but there is actually something he could use their help with. He tells them that he is currently collecting E-rank magic stones, so if they could gather around 100 for him, that would be a huge help. Raven and the others are surprised that that's all Alan wants since E-rank magic stones are pretty much worthless. But since he insists, Raven promises that they will have the stones ready for Alan by next week, and the two say their goodbyes. A few days later, Alan is back on the job as Cecil's servant, and she is currently having him give her a boost so she can reach a jar of jam. Alan asks her why she's doing this, so she explains to him that she wants to bake some yummy cookies to commemorate her brother Mihi's return, but Alan had no idea that Mihi was returning, and he is so shocked that he loses his balance, causing Cecil to fall over. A while later, the family is having lunch, and Granville is quite impressed by how tasty the meal is. Cecil is glad he likes it because it was made with some of the horned rabbits that Alan hunted. Granville is impressed by Alan's skill, but that much should be expected from the son of a warrior like Roden. Granville also mentions that Krena village has met the quota of 20 boars for the year, and Alan is glad to hear that. But he never had a doubt in his mind that they would be able to pull it off. Just then, Thomas asks why they haven't gotten to eat any boar meat if the quota was met, since it used to be the highlight of their winter meals. They haven't had any this year. Alan is surprised to learn of this, but he assumes it must be because the king is the one who requested the quota increase, so all the boar meat must have been sent to the capital. Thomas asks Alan if he can hunt a white deer for lunch next time, but everyone starts yelling at him to not make such an unreasonable request of Alan, since hunting a white deer is no small feat. However, to their surprise, Alan agrees to do it without hesitation. He has been eager to try a new challenge lately, and he assumes a white deer must be somewhere around C rank, so it should be easy. The next day, Alan heads out into the forest, and after digging a pit in the snow, he proceeds to run into the forest to track down a white deer. Once he finally spots one, he summons 4 frogs to act as bait. Using their provoke skills, the frogs easily grab the deer's attention, causing it to charge at them. But when it was about to hit the frogs, Alan desummoned them and then resummoned them at a different location. This goes on for a bit, until Alan eventually leads the deer straight into the hole he dug for it, and now that it is trapped, there's nothing stopping Alan from killing it. An hour later, the staff at the mansion goes into a panic because a giant white deer just showed up at the front gate, but just as they are about to attack it, they hear a voice coming from underneath, and a moment later, Alan rolls out from under the deer. Killing it was easy, and it did give him over 2,000 XP, but it was a serious pain in the butt to carry all the way back here by himself. He asks the other servants to go call Thomas because he hunted this deer specifically for him. And a moment later, the entire family comes out to see what's going on, and Granville is shocked to see that Alan really did hunt a deer. Thomas is delighted since this means they will be able to have deer meat for New Year's, but the rest of the family is still in shock over the whole thing. Granville is starting to wonder if Alan is really talentless, because there's no way a normal 8-year-old should be capable of taking down a C-rank monster on his own, so he plans to have Alan reassessed as soon as possible. A little while later, Alan is called into a meeting with Cebus, where he is informed that he is going to be promoted to a huntsman. As part of his duties as a huntsman, Alan will be expected to hunt food for the household, as well as protect the people in the event of a monster attack, and as payment, he will receive 100 silver coins a month, which is twice his current salary. This may seem like a great deal on the surface, but Alan can tell that they are just trying to get out of having to pay full price for any strong monsters he catches, because that deer alone was worth more than 100 silver, and paying Alan a salary is much cheaper than paying for the monsters he hunts directly. Alan doesn't really mind losing out on the extra money as long as it means he can hunt as much as he wants, but just when he's about to leave to start hunting right away. Cebus tells him to wait because he's still required to do his normal duties as Cecil's servant, so he's only allowed to hunt once a week. Alan is really disappointed to hear that, but it would be rude to complain, so he just sucks it up and goes along with it. A little while later, Alan goes to the port with Cecil to meet Mihi since he is finally coming home from the academy to visit. This is the first time Alan has seen an airship so close up, so he is quite curious about how it works. But Cecil is much more interested in greeting her brother as soon as he steps out. She runs over to Mihi and hugs him tight, telling him all about how much she missed him. She asks why he didn't come home last summer like he promised he would, and Mihi does remember making that promise. But something came up, so he apologizes for disappointing her. Alan walks up to Mihi and offers to carry his bags while Cecil introduces him as her servant. Mihi is a nice guy, and just by taking one look at Alan, he can tell that he's quite talented, so he tells him as much. Alan is relieved that Mihi is so mature, because he wouldn't be able to handle another Cecil. But Cecil and Mihi seem to get along really well as family, and it makes him wonder how his own family is doing. Later that day, Alan is out hunting a few monsters for lunch, and by the time he's done, the chefs are overjoyed because these are the freshest ingredients they've ever gotten, and they are very thankful for Alan's hard work. But just as he was about to put the meat away, he noticed Mihi and Zenov dueling in the garden. Even though Mihi is only 14 years old, he is still quite impressed, especially since he is able to hold his own against someone like Zenov, but the strength gap is still too wide, so Mihi ultimately ends up losing. Everyone praises Mihi for doing such a good job, but then Cecil notices Alan carrying his quarry for the day, and she compliments him on such a good catch. It is undoubtedly impressive that Alan was able to defeat a monster like that, and since they've got a little extra time to kill, Mihi asks Alan if he would like to spar as well. Zenov looks to Granville to see if he approves, and since Granville has no problem with it, Zenov hands Alan his sword so he can fight. Alan is really excited since this is his first time holding a mithril sword, and it has been ages since he did any sparring, so he can't wait. Right now, his stats are optimized for hunting, not combat, but with all the level increases he has been getting lately, he is sure his current build should be able to handle this. The duel begins, and Alan initially tries holding back to avoid hurting Mihi, but as his sword clashes with Mihi's for the first time, Alan realizes something. This dude is strong. Mihi has spent several years training and studying in the Royal Academy, and all those years of experience play a crucial role in combat. So even if Alan is similar to him in terms of strength, his swordsmanship is still novice level at best, so he never stood a chance. Once the duel is over, everyone once again starts praising Mihi's strength, but Cecil does praise Alan as well, since he held up pretty well against Mihi for a while. Thomas asks Mihi how he got so strong, so Mihi explains that he was forced to clear a dungeon as a summer project last year, and that experience made him a lot stronger. Cecil realizes that's probably why Mihi wasn't able to visit last summer, and she feels kind of bad for him. But Alan is busy thinking about how amazing the training Mihi receives at the academy must be. Cecil asks Mihi whether he's going to stay for a while, but unfortunately, he has to head back to the academy in a few days, and he won't be back until summer next year. Alan suddenly asks Mihi to spar with him when he next returns, and Mihi accepts his request. He then shakes Alan's hand and asks him to take care of Cecil until then, and Alan is forced to agree, but internally, he's thinking about the quickest way to get out of this stupid job without dishonoring his father. A little while later, Visgant Carnal shows up to pay Granville a visit, and he makes some snide remarks about this being a backwater town, which Granville laughs off. But it's clear that these two absolutely hate each other. Alan serves Carnal his meal, and Carnal is delighted because he thinks this is the famous boar meat that Granville had been keeping all to himself, but in reality, it's just the horned rabbit Alan hunted. However, Carnal can't really tell the difference. The Carnal and Granville families have been at odds with one another for centuries at this point, and right now, the Carnal territory is doing really well, while the Granville territory is on an economic downturn. The reason for this is the fact that both territories are located on either side of the White Dragon Mountain. The mountain contains a lot of mithril, so both regions have several mines in the mountain, but the dragon on top of the mountain is currently roosting on the Granville side, so they can't use their mines, which is why their economy took such a huge hit. Though, it hasn't always been like this. The dragon is very fickle about its roosting spot, so roughly every 100 years, it switches sides, which flips the power dynamics between the two sides. Anyway, Granville asks Carnal why he came here since this couldn't have been a pointless visit, and Carnal was so preoccupied with his food that he nearly forgot to mention it. But he says his oldest daughter recently underwent her appraisal, and he wanted to personally share the news. Alan assumes Carnal's daughter must have gotten an amazing talent, so he is here to rub it in Granville's face. But to his confusion, Carnal announces that his daughter is talentless, and what makes it even more confusing is the fact that Carnal mockingly reminds Granville that 2 out of his 3 children have talents. Granville gets angry and points out that Carnal also has an older son who has a talent, so that means both of them are going to have to fulfill a noble's duty someday. After that, Carnal leaves, and Alan has no idea what that whole thing was about, but it did teach him that being a noble isn't as much fun as he thought. Sometime later, on one of his days off, Alan meets with the party he helped and asks them for some advice because he's thinking about hunting a few C-rank monsters. After all, he has hunted over 10,000 goblins in the forest already, and farming D ranks really isn't doing it for him anymore. The group warns Alan that C-rank monsters are a lot more dangerous than what he's used to, and Alan is aware of that, which is why he wants to learn everything he can from them before going on his next hunt. Later on, Alan is out in the forest when one of his birds spots a C-rank monster and rushes over to come call him. Alan goes to investigate and finds an orc sleeping under a tree, and this is a perfect opportunity to attack, so he proceeds to jump the orc with a horde of tigers. The orc tries to fight back, but Alan has way too many summons for it to stand a chance, so it eventually succumbs. With the orc dead, Alan carves into its body to retrieve its magic stone, and he's really proud of himself for being able to take down a C-rank monster without needing to trap it first, but he reminds himself that he needs to stay humble because he's still not strong enough to beat Mihi, so he can't make the mistake of getting overconfident. Just then, one of his birds alerts him to another C-rank monster nearby, and this one seems to be an armored ant. Alan is a little hesitant to fight it since he recalls that Raven once nearly died to one of these, but it's a little too late to back out now because the ant has already seen him. Alan has no choice but to attack, so he sends out his tigers, but they aren't able to pierce through the ant's armor, so Alan needs to think of something else. He decides to try using his butterfly summons to put the ant to sleep, and once it rolls over, he jumps on its belly in an attempt to kill it, but his knife won't go through even though his attack power is over 400. The ant soon starts waking up, so Alan frantically starts stabbing it over and over until he finally breaks through its shell and kills it. He's glad that's finally over, but even though the ant was C-rank just like the orc, it took way more effort because it's pretty much immune to physical attacks. He wonders if it would have been easier if he could use magic, but now that he thinks about it, he has a really high intelligence stat, so he might be able to cast spells after all. To find out, he asks Cecil to let him join her during her magic class, and while there, he asks the teacher if it's possible for him to use magic. The teacher pulls out a magic orb and tells Alan it will light up if he has a talent for magic. Alan gives it a try, but no matter how hard he concentrates, nothing happens. He is forced to come to terms with the fact that he's completely magic-less, and he's taking it really hard, so Cecil feels bad for him and offers Alan a cookie to cheer him up. This was the end of episode 8. Subscribe to not miss the next part.